Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking at a really interesting question, I think. Has the U.S. been relying on a couple of, well, powerful, maybe underappreciated advantages? And crucially, does the source material we have suggest they might be starting to, disappear?
Yeah, that's the core of it. We're digging into an article from Vox by Brian Walsh. It was updated very recently, May 29th, 2025.
And the title really sets it up. Trump and Harvard. The U.S. is squandering a major advantage.
Exactly. So our goal here is to unpack what the article's arguing. Like, what are these advantages, first off?
Yeah.
Why have they been so important for the U.S.? And, how might the actions discussed in the piece, especially those tied to the current administration, how might they actually be undermining these advantages?
We're trying to understand the potential fallout, the long-term picture, based on what this source is saying.
Precisely. Understanding the potential consequences.
Okay, so let's get into it. The article starts with this idea of the dollar's exorbitant privilege. That specific phrase, it's not new, is it?
Yeah. No, not at all. It actually goes way back to 1965, coined by Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who was France's finance minister back then.
And how does this privilege actually work, according to the article?
Well, the basic idea is, because the U.S. dollar is so dominant internationally, think trade, finance, it's the world's main currency, essentially.
Okay.
So there's this massive global demand for dollars. Foreign countries, central banks, big companies, they all need dollars. And how do they often hold them? By buying U.S. debt, U.S. Treasury bonds, things like that.
Oh, so that creates a constant market for U.S. government debt.
Exactly. A huge built-in demand. And the big payoff for the U.S. is...
They get to borrow money much more cheaply, right? Lower interest rates than almost anyone else could manage.
That's it. And it also means the U.S. can sustain, pretty large trade deficits year after year and run big budget deficits, too.
Without the kind of immediate harsh consequences other countries would face, like a currency crisis or just crippling debt payments.
Right. The article frames it as this historical ability for America to sort of live beyond its means without facing the immediate music.
But, and there's always a but, the article suggests this privilege might be eroding, not gone, but maybe less exorbitant.
Yeah, that's the nuance. The exorbitance might be lessening. It points to a few signs. Things like harsh tariff policies, recent budget bills, adding trillions to the debt projections, and the fact that annual federal deficits are running around 6% of GDP, GDP being, the total size of the economy. That's a pretty high number sustained over time. And they're market signals too, right? Like interest rates.
Yes. The interest rates on 10-year U.S. Treasury bonds, kind of a benchmark, they've roughly doubled recently to around 4.5%. So borrowing is getting more expensive for the U.S. government.
And what about the dollar's actual share globally?
That's also shifting, according to the article. It says the dollar share of global reserves held by central banks. It peaked around 71% back in Q1 1999.
First quarter, yeah. Right, January to March 99. But by the end of 2024, so Q4, it had dropped to 58%.
This is a noticeable drop.
It is. Now, the article is careful to say, look, the dollar is still dominant. There's no obvious replacement waiting in the wings.
Okay.
But the ease, the sheer benefit, the low cost that came with being the world's currency, that seems to be shrinking. It reduces that cushion the U.S. has had, makes it harder to just paper over big fiscal problems. The bill, as the article implies, might be coming due, or at least getting harder to postpone.
Okay, so that's privilege number one, the dollar. But the article says there's a second one, maybe even more vital.
Yes, absolutely. The second one is about the global leadership of America's elite universities. The household names, Harvard, Princeton, MIT, Caltech, places like that.
And the argument is these schools are more than just good schools.
Much more, according to this piece. It argues that since World War II, these institutions have been basically unmatched worldwide. They're framed as the bedrock of U.S. scientific supremacy.
Which in turn fuels economic growth, innovation.
Exactly. They're presented as a key engine for the whole U.S. economy for decades.
And what makes them so special, according to the article, it's not just the buildings or the history, is it?
No, the core element highlighted is their unique power to attract the very best minds from literally everywhere around the globe.
Ah, the global talent magnet idea.
Precisely. The author calls this an educational privilege. The U.S. becomes this focal point, pulling in top academic talent from all over the world.
And the article connects this to something else about the U.S. education system.
Yes, and this is a really critical point in the argument. This educational privilege, attracting the world's best to its top universities, has effectively compensated for, or masked, what the article describes as a generally mediocre K-12 education system in the U.S.
So kindergarten through high school, the performance there isn't world-leading, but the universities compensate by bringing in outside talent.
That's the core argument, that
Yeah.
the elite universities attracting global talent have allowed the U.S. to maintain scientific leadership despite shortcomings earlier in the domestic education pipeline.
Okay, I see the connection. But now, the article contends, this second privilege, the university one, is actively under attack.
Yes, that's the central claim regarding current events. It points to actions attributed to the Trump administration that seem, in the article's view, designed to weaken this specific advantage.
Like what, specifically?
Well, it mentions things like reports of cutting off federal funding to certain universities. Columbia and Princeton are named as examples. And also actions perceived as undermining key science funding agencies like the National Institutes of Health, NIH, or the National Science Foundation, NSF.
Agencies critical for basic research.
Absolutely vital. And then there's a very specific recent example discussed concerning international students.
At Harvard?
Yes, a move affecting international students at Harvard, with the worry expressed in the article that this could be a test case or spread to other institutions.
And it connects this to broader policy statements.
It does. It references a statement from Secretary of State Marco Rubio about aggressively revoking visas for certain Chinese students and increasing scrutiny for all Chinese applicants going forward.
Including those from Hong Kong, the article notes.
Right, and the article makes a point of saying these are often students educated in relatively open systems, the kind of people, it argues, a previous version of America would have actively welcomed.
So the implication is that shutting the door on this global talent,
Yeah.
what's the potential impact described?
The article frames it in pretty stark terms. It suggests that losing this ability to attract the world's best minds is fundamentally damaging. It calls it potentially a death blow to what makes these elite schools truly elite.
And if these schools are weakened,
Then, the argument goes, the U.S. itself is weakened, scientifically and economically.
and the author loops this back to the dollar analogy again.
Exactly. Just like losing the dollar's exorbitant privilege means facing the actual cost of fiscal policies.
Yeah.
Losing the university's educational privilege means the U.S. would start to really feel the consequences of, well, decades of what the article implies is underperformance in its K-12 system. The buffer is gone.
Okay, let's dig into that reliance on foreign talent.
Yeah.
The article provides some numbers, right?
Oh, yeah, some really striking statistics to back this up. It's not just that foreign students pay tuition, though that's mentioned as important financial support for universities.
It's more about their role in research.
Absolutely foundational. I mean, get this. The article states 70%, 70 of U.S. graduate students in electrical engineering are foreign-born.
Wow, 70%.
And 63% in computer science. These are, incredibly critical fields for the future.
Huge majorities.
Yeah.
What about the broader STEM workforce?
Looking at the whole U.S. STEM workforce, science, technology, engineering, math, about 19% are foreign-born overall.
What?
But, and this is key, if you zoom in on the people with PhDs, those doing the most advanced research, that figure jumps to 43%. Nearly half of the PhD-level STEM workforce in the U.S. wasn't born in the U.S.
That's incredible. And the Nobel Prizes.
Yeah, that really highlights the impact at the very highest level. The article notes roughly half of U.S. Nobel Prizes in physics, chemistry, and medicine since the early 1900s went to Americans.
Okay.
But about a third of those American winners were actually foreign-born individuals who came to the U.S. And that fraction, the article says, has been increasing more recently.
So the contribution is significant and growing.
So significant that the article makes a really bold statement. It suggests that if you hypothetically removed all foreign scientists and students from the U.S., American science would essentially grind to a halt.
That's a strong claim. So if the U.S. is so dependent, why can't American-born students just step up and fill those grad school slots, those research positions?
Well, this brings us right back to the point about the K-12 system. The article argues the domestic pipeline isn't currently strong enough to do that.
And it uses test scores to illustrate this.
Yeah, it points to the 2022 PISA results. That's the Program for International Student Assessment, a big international comparison of 15-year-olds.
How did the U.S. do?
U.S. students scored below the average for OECD countries. That's the group of mostly wealthy, developed nations in mathematics.
Below average in math.
And only slightly above average in reading and science.
And this isn't just pandemic-related learning loss.
No, the article stresses this performance lag, especially in math, was there well before the pandemic. It says other wealthy nations were already outperforming U.S. students in math by roughly the equivalent of a full school year.
So the conclusion is the U.S. K-12 system is okay, but not great.
The article's assessment is basically merely fine. And the argument is that merely fine isn't good enough to sustain global scientific leadership on its own.
Especially compared to the U.S.'s own history.
Exactly. The article contrasts this with the past. The U.S. was a pioneer in, mass high school education and then later expanding college access, especially with things like the GI Bill after World War II.
Right, helping veterans go to college.
Yeah, which led to a highly educated workforce. It cites a stat. By 1950, 34% of U.S. adults over 25 had finished high school or more. That was way ahead of places like the U.K. or France back then.
And that educated population powered major achievements.
Like the moon landing, the article suggests, it was built on that strong domestic educational foundation.
But then other countries caught up in educating their populations.
They did. They improved their own system significantly. And as that happened, the article argues the U.S. maintained its scientific edge less by outpacing everyone domestically and more by using its elite universities to pull in the best talent from all over the world.
So the takeaway is if you remove that global talent magnet,
then U.S. science starts to look more like its K-12 system.
Yeah.
Maybe proficient, maybe fine, but not uniquely dominant, not the undisputed world leader it has been.
The article also seems to suggest a specific focus on certain institutions, like Harvard.
Yeah, it raises the possibility that Harvard is being targeted, perhaps to make an example. It mentions reports of the administration considering things like canceling federal contracts with Harvard and even discussing redirecting research grants away from universities like that and towards, say, trade schools.
How permanent could the damage be, according to this analysis?
Well, the article draws a distinction. Funding cuts, like maybe confidence in the dollar, you could argue those could potentially be reversed by future policy changes.
Okay.
But the article makes a stronger point that creating an environment perceived as fundamentally unwelcoming or even hostile to foreign students and scientists that could cause damage that's much harder to undo, maybe even irreversible.
Losing trust, basically.
Exactly. Trust and reputation take a long time to build and can be damaged quickly. And it mentions a specific policy proposal that seems to embody that potential hostility.
Which is?
The idea reportedly being considered requiring all international students applying to U.S. universities to undergo vetting of their social media accounts.
All international students. That sounds intensive.
Very. And the article immediately raises the question of global competition. Universities everywhere want the best students.
Sure, it's a global market for talent.
Right. So if the U.S. implements policies that seem overly intrusive or make the process difficult and unwelcoming, what happens?
Top students might just go elsewhere.
That's the concern raised. SAR students from places like Japan, South Korea, Germany, Finland, students with excellent options in other countries, they might just choose to study somewhere that feels more welcoming, less like they're under suspicion. They might bypass the U.S. altogether.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. The core argument from this Vox piece seems to be
that the U.S. has benefited massively from two key, maybe intertwined privileges. First, the dollar's global dominance, giving it economic leeway.
right.
And second, the world-leading status of its top universities, which is heavily dependent on their ability to attract the best international talent.
And the danger, according to the article, is that specific policy actions being discussed or implemented are chipping away at both of these foundational advantages at the same time.
Precisely. And while the dollar's status might fluctuate or could potentially recover with different policies, the article suggests that making the U.S. seem hostile to foreign talent could inflict a much deeper, longer-lasting wound, a self-inflicted one.
It really emphasizes that the current scientific prowess of the U.S. isn't solely built on its domestic education system, especially K-12, which it calls merely fine.
Yeah, it argues that strength relies critically on being that magnet for brilliant minds from everywhere else, compensating for domestic weaknesses.
So the big question the article leaves us with is, what happens if that magnet gets turned off, or at least significantly weakened? What does that mean for U.S. science, innovation, and its place in the world?
And that leads to a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. The article paints this picture. The U.S. first led scientifically by educating its own population exceptionally well for its time.
Right, the post-war boom.
Then, as others caught up educationally, it maintained leadership by becoming the world's destination for top minds via its elite universities.
So two different paths to leadership.
Exactly. Now, if the actions discussed in the article make the U.S. appear hostile or unwelcoming to developing either of those strengths by not investing enough in broad domestic education and by deterring top international talent, what's the future? What does that mean for America's scientific and economic standing in a world where the competition for talent is fiercer than ever? What specific details from this deep dive struck you the most?
Thanks for joining us for the